People who have heard deathbed confessions, what were some interesting ones? My grandma confessed to murder on her deathbed. Usually you'd think it was the pain relief, but she was such an eccentric it was actually believable. We traced all her ex-husbands, partners, and any other likely candidates, and fortunately no one was missing or died an untimely death. But sometimes I wonder. My dad had Alzheimer's and ended up in a secure ward. He was blind and almost deaf. I was visiting him one day. He didn't know who I was, but he started talking about me. He said I had done better than him in life and that he was proud of me. He was a quiet man in real life and never told me that when I was growing up. Looking back, he did things that my dumb ass never realized were for me. Like, when he retired, his colleagues asked what he'd like as a present. He chose a scientific calculator. This was back in the 1970s. He had no use for it. He gave it to me for university. I thought he was just passing it on, not realizing that he'd asked for it with me in mind. It wasn't a deathbed confession, but I cared for an elderly neighbor who had Alzheimer's, and sometimes she seemed to want to unburden herself of secrets. In the months before she went into a nursing home, I heard a lot about very minor transgressions at work, feuds with other ladies at church, and some cousin fucking. I have an amazing one. My great-grandmother lived a very long and interesting life. She was in her 20s in the Great Depression. She had a wild streak from those days that we don't know much about, to the point that we actually don't know our great-grandfather's name, just the husband she took later. Over the course of her nearly 100-year life, she had collected owls, literally thousands of owl figurines. She had clocks, wall hangings, pot holders, lamps, stained glass art, salt shakers, and more little figurines than you could imagine, all depicting owls. We all wondered the importance of the owls. She never talked about them. We just all knew she loved owls. Well, when she was nearing death, at the age of 98 or 99, and the docs said she had days, my grandparents went and talked to her, and they asked her if she had anything she wanted to share or ask before she goes. She thought for a moment, then said, "I never understood the owls." It turns out, she didn't really give a shit about owls. Near as we could piece together sometime in the 40s or 50s perhaps, she bought either a trivet or a set of salt pepper shakers that were owls. Then someone got her the other. Those were the oldest owls anyone could remember, but from there, someone got her an owl to match, probably a pot holder or placemat. And all of a sudden, her kitchen was owl-themed. From there, it snowballed. The owls flowed like wine, baffling her for 60 years, eventually taking over as the bulk of her personal belongings. The moral is, if you're not actually into something, mention it early. Not my story, but that of a hospice worker who spoke to my class. For those who don't know, hospice is a method of end-of-life care that focuses on alleviating the emotional and physical pain of a dying person to ease their passing rather than combating their imminent death. One of her patients was a bedbound woman in her 90s who was generally unresponsive but had flashes of recognition and engagement. It's hard to gauge the level to which unresponsive patients are detached from their surroundings, so they encourage family members to keep their company in hopes of soothing the patient. Now this patient was from a U.S. state that prided itself on its state university and the university's football team. The woman's family had attended this university for 4 or 5 generations. During her hospice care, however, her great-granddaughter was the first in their family to decide to go to a different school, the rival state's university, in fact. Her family was supportive of her decision, but often joked about her being the rebel or Judas or what have you. One day, they were all sitting around the woman's bedside, teasing the girl about her decision. Suddenly, the patient sat up, looked at her great-granddaughter, said, "Traitor," and fucking died. Edit. Thanks for the awards. For what it's worth, the hospice worker said, her family, eventually, thought it was hilarious. Go Bucks. My partner's grandfather never spoke about his World War II service. We are Australian. He joined after lying about his name and age, so we can't find any records. He would have been 16. We do know he was in the Pacific somewhere, and when he got back, his lie was exposed, and because he was by then 18, he was drafted under his real name, and promptly arrested. He would do anything to not get sent back to fight. He got drunk, fought, and self-harmed. His adult life was spent mostly as an alcoholic and being a shit husband and father, though in his later years, he was able to make some good. Grandkids appearing softened him. In his dying hours, he relived his time at war. Some things he said, "Oh God, they are here. The Japs are behind us, sir. Stab him, fucking stick him. Help medic all around." And he also had a string of names he kept saying. Such a tortured, broken mind. My time to shine. I worked at a hospital in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, a small town near Munich, for the last 14 years. My job there is not fancy at all. I move people around, throw the trash out, and occasionally I take care of some handy-like work, fix a leaking shower head and stuff like that. As you can imagine, I get to see a lot of patients that come and go. Some of them pass away. Such is life, I guess. I remember a few instances of people confessing to me their biggest regrets. Here are some examples. An old Polish woman told me that she regretted not fucking Hitler when she had the chance. Her words. I wanted to ask her about more context, but I was afraid to be honest. Another notable example was an old truck driver that used to work for an Easter Germany company. He told me that he once run over some kids with his truck and was too afraid to stop and check if they were okay. Once another Polish lady told me that she used to be a prostitute during the Second World War, and that she slept with very high-up people in the government. She told me that she did not regret that part of her life, but that she could not tell anyone, and that was a heavy emotional drag. She also told me that she aborted more than 5 babies during that time. My grandma suffered from dementia for many years before she passed. It got so bad she didn't remember who her family were, and would barricade herself in her home because she was scared of everyone. She even forgot she smoked and would find her cigarettes months later after forgetting where they were, and claim she was desperate for one. She'd put them away after one, and that would be her again for months. The only memories she had left at the end was that her sister used to be able to play the piano beautifully, and her husband, her childhood sweetheart, was gone, but she didn't know where. He'd died some time earlier. She spent her days waiting for him to come home from wherever he was. "My John will be home soon," she would say. Or someone would walk past the window and she'd double take and say, "Thought that was my John." It was heartbreaking watching her deteriorate until she was on her deathbed, unaware of anything or anyone. I went to say my goodbyes to her in the hospital, and she held my hand and told me how much she loved me, but how she was ready to go be with John now. In that moment, she remembered who I was, what was happening to her, and that her husband, my granddad, had gone already. She went in her sleep not long after that, and I'm forever thankful I managed to say goodbye and tell her how much I loved her too. I've held on to that moment for so long without really digesting it in any way that writing this just tore my heart out. I miss them both so much, but I know they're finally together again somewhere. My grandpa is pretty far gone, far enough that he doesn't recognize his kids when he sees them, and they have to explain who they are, which got awkward the last time my mom watched him, because he thinks she's very attractive but wasn't aware that she was his daughter, and he hit on her a lot. One thing he repeated to himself a lot is a rhyme he used to say to my grandma. It's a sweet little rhyme with her nickname. He adored her. They were together for nearly 45 years before she died. He's outlived her by nearly 30 years now, and she seems to be the one thing he actually consistently remembers. This isn't a confession, but I just wanted to share the last thing my grandfather said to me before he passed away due to lung cancer. I was about to go to Rome for a school trip, and my family told me to go to set my mind on something else for a few days. Before I left, I wanted to say goodbye, as it was possibly the last time I could talk to him. He told me, "Have fun, boy. I'll see you next week." I went to Rome, and when I came back, he was already in a deep sleep due to medication. He wanted to peacefully pass away while sleeping. I came back the next week and he was sleeping when I went to visit him. I told him everything I did in Rome, even though I knew he wouldn't wake up. The next morning, he passed away. My grandmother said to me, "He waited for you." I still miss him so much. When I was in hospital, the guy in the bed next to me just asked to stop taking his meds as he was ready to die. Last thing I heard him say was, "There's no one waiting for me at home, so I'm going where they are." Wasn't really a shocking confession, just a lonely and heartbreaking one. My dad has a special ability to gain people's trust, in a good way. Twice now he's had instances where dying people tell him things that they feel they can't tell their family. The one case was when my aunt's mother-in-law was dying. She explained to my dad that her husband cannot live alone, and that they both agree he must find a new partner after she passes. He did. He remarried within a year of her passing, at the age of 81. The family was very upset about him moving on so fast. My dad had to stand up for him and reassure them that it is what his late wife wanted. I am going to guess it is not so much of a special ability as a measure of honesty. Most people try to paste on smile and be positive to people as they get weaker. I have had good conversations with elderly relatives near their passing, and we have discussed serious stuff. So your dad, not denying the obvious, lets them talk about what is on their minds. I didn't see it, but my aunt watched her elderly mother fall down the stairs and confessed just before she died that she wasn't her biological mother. She told my aunt that her oldest sister was actually her mother. The sister had gotten pregnant too young, and the mom said it was hers, a common way of handling it back then. She revealed it in her very last breath. My great-uncle actually confessed to having 2 illegitimate sons right before he kicked the bucket in front of his own children and grandchildren. The crazy thing was that none of his children knew this life of his. Not even my great-aunt knew about it, because she would have made a huge fuss if she was alive at that time and knew about it. What was crazier was that these 2 sons already passed away 5 and 7 years ahead of him, respectively. He was 98 years old, and his invisible sons were 65 and 69 years old. The children found out that one of his invisible sons actually was a teacher at a school that his granddaughters attended when they were in high school. Nevertheless, his children decided to reach out to the children of his invisible sons. They got connected and learned more stuff about my granduncle. The craziest thing was that I actually dated one of the granddaughters of one of the invisible sons. The one passed away at the age of 69 years old. Talking about a few degrees of separation, My great-grandfather was in his mid-90s when he died. Health was always good, but a benign tumor deemed too dangerous to operate on at his age went septic. He was dead a week later. I went to visit him in the hospital. My family used to see him a lot, but there was a falling out between him and my grandma several years before, so we stopped seeing them. Funny enough though, I constantly ran into him at the store, and we always had nice chats. Anyway, in the hospital, he told me not to worry about him. Most everyone he's ever known was dead, and he was ready to die. The week he felt himself getting sick, he knows something was off, and made arrangements to get my great-grandma into a nursing home. He took care of her with her Alzheimer's, so he wouldn't die until he knew she was taken care of. They were married for over 70 years. My favorite story is that every Sunday for over 50 years, he would drop my great-grandma off at church, and then sat in the car and waited for her. Hated religion, but loved his wife LOL. Not a deathbed confession exactly. I was a hospice volunteer and worked with a man with a brain tumor. He was in pretty shape except for that. He was going nuts in the nursing home, and one day I took him for a ride around town. He had grown up there. Seemed like every other block he would point at an old building and say, "Used to be a whorehouse there. Empty lot. Used to be a building there, and it had a pretty good whorehouse there. There was a whore there until it burned down." We passed by this old, odd-looking apartment building that had more doors than it should have, and it appeared some of them were sealed up. He said, "That used to be a crib, and each door had a small room behind it, and each whore had her own room." We passed under a railroad bridge, and he pointed a flat area, and there used to be black woman that ran the best whorehouse in the state right there. I finally laughed and said, "Guess I know what you spent your youth doing." I didn't witness this personally as it was between my grandfather and his father. My great-grandfather was not a nice man. He beat his children. One time he beat his daughter with a table leg. And I am assuming did the same to his wife. Anyway, she left him and the kids behind. This was the 30s, and I'm assuming that he didn't allow her to take the kids with her. And it's not like women's rights were great back then. My grandfather left home at 8 years old and fended for himself for his entire life. On his deathbed, Nasty Grandpa told the boys that he had a bunch of money stashed on the old property, and if they went to see him, he would tell them where it was. No one went. Edit for clarity. Nasty Grandpa was my great-grandfather. I did some work in a nursing home, helped with a guy that had a bad stroke, could hardly speak, some trouble moving around. To speed up the story, a nurse and I had some trouble with him, and later I said that stroke really made him mean. She replied, "Not really." I grew down the street from him, and he was always a miserable man. He was always drinking and abusive to his wife and kids. His kids came to our house all the time and stayed, and my folks let them because he was so awful to them. Later he had that stroke and they dumped him here. They never come to see him, not even at Christmas or his birthday. If we need them for something, they come in and see us and don't go to his room or look for him. They just do what needs to be done and leave. Mother ran a nursing home growing up. From ages 5 to 10, I spent every weekend with residents. Because I was a kid, residents often confessed stuff they thought I wouldn't understand. Two stick out. One funny, one not. Women was dying, maybe about 96. Even had her last burst of energy life where she thought she was better. This is common. A black delivery man came with some flowers. After he left, she looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "I can't believe I'm dying without having been with a colored man." Second one was while I was reading Bible verses to a resident. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to drop that baby in the well."